All right, so I think we're gonna start. Hi, everyone. My name is Ina. I am the Women's Committee Chair for Americans Against Anti-Semitism. Americans Against Anti-Semitism was founded by the former Assemblyman Dov Hikind in order to combat the growing threat of anti-Semitism that our country has been experiencing. The Women's Committee is a subgroup of Americans Against Anti-Semitism that was launched back in February, and really it was started to empower female voices to speak up against anti-Semitism. And I've been privileged to head this committee. If you guys would like to check out AAA, Americans Against Anti-Semitism, you can go to www.americansaa.org, or you can check us out on our Facebook page at Americans Against Anti-Semitism, and the Women's Committee is Women's Committee for Americans Against Anti-Semitism on Facebook as well. We are super excited to have our speaker with us today. She's gonna present for about 20 minutes, and then we're gonna run a question answer session where you guys can, I think there's a Q&A on the bottom of your screens. So you guys can ask the questions while she's speaking, and then she'll address them afterwards. Okay, so to introduce our speaker, Becca Wertman. Becca, thank you so much for being with us today. Becca is the managing editor and Canada liaison at NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based research institute. Becca grew up in Vancouver and graduated with honors from the University of Southern California, where she earned her BA in International Relations with minors in French and Economics. Becca also has an MA in Political Science from Columbia University, where she participated in efforts to combat BDS on campus. Becca regularly speaks at the UN Human Rights Council on behalf of the Institute for NGO Research, NGO Monitor's parent organization. Her articles have been widely published, including in the Hill Times, The Province, The Jerusalem Post, The Post-Millennial, YNET, JNS, and Times of Israel. So Becca, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's fantastic not only that an organization like Americans Against Anti-Semitism exists, but also that there's a women's committee, and it's fantastic that, you know, I'm here in Jerusalem in Israel, and we're able to connect overseas for this common fight. So I'm just gonna open up my PowerPoint presentation that I prepared. One moment. Perfect. So as you saw in the advertisement for this event, I'm going to talk to you today about conspiracies, viruses, and plagues, and specifically about how COVID-19 is weaponized against the Jewish people. And I'm sure for many of you, if you're participating in this webinar, you're probably familiar with the fact that this COVID-19 and the link between anti-Semitism, it's not the first time that a sort of pandemic and anti-Semitism have been linked. Of course, you can think of the Black Death, the plague, and how the Jews were blamed for that. And it was no surprise to many of us working in the field when COVID-19 came to be, that we saw the Jews being blamed for it, that we saw also, the Jews being blamed, as I said, for not just the existence of this virus, but also for its spread. We later saw, of course, Israel being blamed for it. These are all different manifestations of anti-Semitism. Of course, what happened in New York with the Jews in New York being singled out for spreading the virus in their community. These are all different forms of anti-Semitism. And I'm sure, as I said, that many of you have heard these different examples. So what I'd like to do this evening, it's evening in Israel, afternoon for many of you, is talk to you about maybe something a bit different, a bit of a more unique aspect of this discussion, which is the role of non-governmental organizations, groups that call themselves human rights organizations, and how they are part of this campaign to promote anti-Semitism and how they're using COVID-19 in order to do so. I'd also like to talk about how they're able to get the resources in order to promote these campaigns. So in order to do that, I'm going to take a step back talk a little bit about the world of non-governmental organizations and where my organization came from, where the idea for it sort of came to be. And then we'll get into the examples of anti-Semitism as they relate to COVID-19. So perhaps some of you might be familiar with something called the Durban Conference. It was a conference that took place in 2001 in Durban, South Africa. And what many people know about the conference is that it was a meeting of heads of states, that it was supposed to be this world conference to combat racism and xenophobia. And what it turned out to be was an anti-Semitic hate fest, and many Western democracies in its later iterations boycotted this conference. Now, what a lot of people don't know about this conference is that while the heads of states were meeting, non-governmental organizations were also meeting. Groups that you might be familiar with, like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International, FIDH, again, these sort of human rights heroes of the world, as well as more local organizations such as Palestinian groups and other local groups. They also met on the sidelines of this conference. And they came up with their own declaration. And that declaration, as you can see from the points on the screen, declared Israel as a racist apartheid state. And they basically came up with the framework for what we saw a few years later, were the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS campaigns that many of you see today. I'm sure many of you who are familiar with BDS, perhaps on campus, have seen this sort of rhetoric used in your campus. So my boss, Professor Gerald Steinberg, he's a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. He saw this event happen and he thought it was odd. Why were human rights groups taking part in this anti-Semitic hate fest? So he decided to explore that question as an academic, and in doing so founded what is now NGO Monitor. And the project has grown in the past 20 years. What started as his research question is now an organization of over 20 people. We're based in Jerusalem, as I said, and we monitor over 200 different non-governmental organizations that are active in promoting anti-Semitism and promoting BDS. And we monitor groups that have ties to terrorist organizations, and we expose their activities, and we also expose their funding. Because without the funding, these organizations wouldn't be able to promote the hate that they do. We also have a special status that allows, called UN ECOSOC status, that allows us to also present our information at the United Nations. So as I said, these non-governmental organizations, they wouldn't be able to do what they do without the money. And specifically at NGO Monitor, we're very interested in the groups that receive government funding. Now, it might sound crazy, and it is, but many of the different BDS organizations, many of the different groups that promote anti-Semitism are actually bankrolled by European governments. And that's not to say that Canada and the US are not immune. They also provide funds to these sorts of groups, but the numbers are much smaller than what we see from Europe. So at NGO Monitor, what we do is we look at the organizations and we try to expose the hypocrisy. What do I mean by that? Most of these governments that you saw on the previous screen, the European governments, Canada, the United States, their governments all condemn anti-Semitism. Many of them outright condemn BDS. Many of them have adopted the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. Yet at the same time, their taxpayer funds are going to groups that are promoting the very campaigns that their policies supposedly condemn. So we expose that hypocrisy. We share our information on our website and reports, in the media, in direct meetings with government officials and at the United Nations. And we hope that by exposing this information that we affect policy change, that we ensure that the funding that's supposed to be going towards humanitarian aid or towards creating peace indeed goes to those causes. So we also, another thing that's very important for us to do is not just expose the groups, but ensure that there's better policy in place that doesn't allow for this sort of misuse of funds. If a government, condemns anti-Semitism, there should be some sort of a mechanism in place that ensures that the taxpayer dollars that the government funds are not going to groups that promote those campaigns. So those are some of the things that we at NGO Monitor do. And I want to make sure I give you some clear examples because it's all theoretical and probably a bit confusing. So at NGO Monitor, as I said, we monitor over 200 different kinds of non-governmental organizations. As I said, we look at groups promoting anti-Semitism, BDS, and since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've been looking a lot at groups that are exploiting the pandemic in order to promote their hate-filled campaigns and often anti-Semitism. So I'd first like to just give you, one last example before I get into the COVID-19, because I think this is one of the clearest NGO anti-Semitism examples that there is. If all of you are looking at your screens, you can see these are anti-Semitic cartoons. They're adaptations of classical anti-Semitic tropes. You have the octopus with the Star of David. You have a Hasidic Jew with a bloody pitchfork. These are very classic anti-Semitic symbols. And these cartoons actually appeared, they were winners of a caricature contest by a Palestinian NGO, hosted by a Palestinian NGO called Badil. And these, again, are some of the winners of this contest. As you can also see on the screen, the government of Sweden, Switzerland, Denmark, and the Netherlands actually provided funds to this organization that was promoting these anti-Semitic images. That is until this information was exposed, and those governments actually cut off the funding to this group. So in the context of the pandemic, it was no surprise that we saw these sorts of anti-Semitic tropes kind of come to be, and again, from groups that are calling themselves human rights organizations. Now, unfortunately, Holy Land Trust, this NGO, they're not transparent. And this happens sometimes at NGO Monitor, where either the NGO doesn't publish the funding themselves, and we're unable to track the funding through the government or other kind of Google searches. So Holy Land Trust, unfortunately, we don't know the donors, but I still wanted to include this example because I think it's a very clear link between COVID-19 and anti-Semitism. And in this example, you see that Israel is being compared to this sort of virus. It's an article supposedly about COVID-19 and how it's affecting Palestinians. In reality, it's this comparison between Israel and a virus. What's also important to know about the NGOs is they don't exist in a vacuum. Again, these are supposedly human rights organizations. They're Palestinian civil society. They are apparently the on-the-ground voices, and that information is shared and picked up by different groups, often by politicians, often by the media. So here you can see that that post was shared by the executive of the organization, and it was then again shared by an individual from the Platform for French NGOs, which is a very large French non-governmental organization. Another example that I think very clearly shows this phenomenon is there was a cartoon video produced by a Palestinian organization called Adamir. Adamir is a group that we at NGO Monitor have been monitoring very closely for a number of years because of the group's ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine terrorist organization. And we have a very interesting report on our website. If you just type in Adamir, I'm sure it will be one of the first things that comes up in your Google search, is our report exposing the ties between different board members, different staff members, and of Adamir and the PFLP terror group. That's on one side. On the other side, you have this anti-Semitic video that was posted. And in this video, Israel is sort of being blamed for spreading the virus into Palestinian prisons. As I said, Adamir has ties to the PFLP terror group, and their main advocacy point is about Israel freeing Palestinian prisoners. So here you see the link between COVID-19 and their standard agenda and kind of blaming Israel for a scenario that didn't even occur, but a possible scenario of, it's going to be Israel's fault if these Palestinians get sick. And again, at the top here, you have who's funding it. So Adamir receives government funding from some communities in Spain, as well as from Switzerland in the past. Another example that I wanted to show you is Zohrat. an Israeli organization that, as you can see, receives funding through indirect funding from Germany and indirect funding from Switzerland. And what that means is that the funding is given to a government, from a government to another institution that then is giving the money to the NGO. And this was an article that Zochrot posted about, it was called, as you can see on the screen, COVID-19 in Times of Settler Colonialism. And in the article, they compare Israel to different colonialist, historical colonialist enterprises, and talking about how the colonialists spread the plague, and how, of course, you can fill in the blanks yourself, I'm sure, Israel is spreading the virus. There's also, I'm sure if, I'm assuming many of you who are listening are based in the US, so I'm sure you're familiar with BDS. If any of you have been on campus in recent years or active in that field, I'm sure you're familiar with those campaigns that are going on. So this is an example that we found on the BDS movement's Twitter. This is just a screenshot that I took. And the reason I included this is kind of a representation of many of the campaigns, the different NGO campaigns that we've seen. And that is to preemptively blame Israel for Palestinian deaths. And that, as we see it, is a form of a blood libel, blaming the Jewish state preemptively for deaths of non-Jews. And we've seen this particularly when it comes to Gaza. Thankfully, we've actually, seems like we're nearing the end of what they say is the first wave of the virus here in Israel. And thankfully, we've had, there's been very strict measures and very good results because of it. And thankfully, you know, there of course have been some deaths, but the spread has been very much contained. But these NGOs, they're not looking at that. It doesn't matter to them what is actually going on. It's about consistently blaming Israel, about singling out Israel, and again, preemptively blaming Israel for the deaths of Palestinians. So you can see in the image, that's what this is talking about. Also, another point I'll just raise, because you know, it's here on the screen. It talks about how Israel is blamed for the destruction of health services. These campaigns never mention the role of the Palestinian Authority or Hamas, or how Hamas has used, instead of building hospitals, Hamas has built terror tunnels. Those sorts of things are not mentioned by these organizations. It's very consistent about blaming Israel. And the last example I'd like to give is another example from the BDS campaign. And this example just has a little bit of everything here. This was a post, it was supposed to be, it's labeled as a fact sheet. It was published a few weeks ago, as you can see, the date is April 20th. Every single one of the links of quote unquote fact featured in this document links to something from the beginning of March. So you can imagine the situation has changed dramatically since then. And a lot of the claims that are therefore made in this article are simply false. Again, this quote unquote fact sheet is preemptively blaming Israel. And they're just using COVID-19 as another way to promote the boycott agenda. So what we at NGO Monitor have been doing since the start of the pandemic, we anticipated that these sorts of campaigns would happen. We've seen NGOs latch onto whatever the hot topic is, whether it be LGBTQ rights, whether it be environmentalism, it doesn't matter, whether it be women's rights. The NGOs will always latch onto those subjects in order to promote their anti-Semitic and anti-Israel agenda. So we anticipated that at the start of the pandemic. And if any of you are interested in knowing more about these campaigns, we have a short report on our website that we update every few days with these sorts of campaigns. So I just put the direct link for you here, or if you just go on our website, which is ngo-monitor.org, you can type in exploiting or coronavirus or COVID-19 and the post will come up and you can see all the different NGO campaigns that are exploiting the pandemic. So I'm gonna finish up here so that we have time for questions, but I always like to try to end these presentations on a positive note, since it's a lot of information. It's often hard to hear that human rights NGOs are promoting these sorts of campaigns, that they're receiving funding from governments. But there is something that you can do. It's very important to educate your members of parliament or your congressmen, your government officials about the importance of transparency and accountability and oversight over international aid. You know, when the United States gives foreign aid, it passes through a number of channels, and it's very important for that process to be clear and for people like you and me to be able to understand where the taxpayers are going, to make sure that the organizations align with the government's policy. You know, if an organization has ties to a terror group, or if it's promoting clear anti-Semitism, of course the funding should be cut. And like I said earlier, new policy changes can be made in order to prevent those sorts of funding, that sort of funding in the future. I think it's also really one of the most important things for viewers like you to know is that we publish everything on our website. Everything includes sources. We use hyperlinks. Everything has a hyperlink. We want you, the viewers, to be able to use our information in your own campaigns in fighting anti-Semitism. What I often tell to students, I'm not sure if there's any students here, but sometimes a speaker will come to campus and speak for the BDS campaign. And you might not know who that speaker is, and you might not know what organization they're from, but you can go on NGO Monitor's website and you can find out some information that might help you in your advocacy. So I think that's very important. And, you know, if you're working with Americans Against Anti-Semitism, you might see that there's someone speaking in Congress or speaking in your local community. And if they're involved in an NGO and they are promoting some sort of BDS or anti-Semitism, there's a good chance that in our database, we have some information that can help you. So I encourage you, I'll put our website here, to go on our website. It's an open resource. We have lots of information, and I would love to hear your questions on this subject.
All right, so we have some questions from the audience. The first question, can you hear me, Becca?
Yes, I can. I can hear you.
All right, just give me 1 second. Okay, so the first question we have is, how much do headlines of Jews breaking social distancing rules contribute to this type of anti-Semitism?
So I think, like I said, what I do at NGO Monitor is primarily focused on the NGOs. So I think, I mean, I can tell you in Israel, we heard that everyone heard that headline. Anyone I think who's interested in this subject, and I hope beyond that circle, heard that headline. But at NGO Monitor, we're even more interested in how those kinds of statements are spread through the NGO network, how the NGOs themselves, who are often thought of as these sort of principled activists, how they're promoting these sorts of campaigns and hatred as well. I think there's a lot of interconnectedness between those different networks that really feeds the anti-Semitism. And I think with Twitter and with social media, it spreads so quickly.
Okay, and we have another question. Are you seeing any differences between hate groups and the types of conspiracies they're pushing? Are white supremacists and Palestinians spreading the same ideas or different? And if different, how so?
So I've heard a theory that I liked about that subject, which is that anti-Semitism kind of meets in the circle. So the extremists from both sides, the commonality they have is unfortunately anti-Semitism. So I think I follow a lot of different people and groups on social media just to understand what the rhetoric is from both sides. And it's consistent throughout history that Jews are always the scapegoat. And I think, you know, it's from both sides of the aisle, whether that be the extreme right or the extreme left. And especially what we look at NGO Monitor is the government funded organizations most of those groups, what we see are different Palestinian groups. So we're primarily focused on that subject.
Okay, we have another question that just came in. How do President Trump's changes to Title V protections, including Jewish students, factor into the amount of anti-Israel campaigns on campus? Since the university allows it, the school risks losing its federal funding.
So I got my master's degree at Columbia University, so I'm very familiar with the sorts of anti-Semitic and BDS campaigns that exist on campus. I've written a number of articles about my experience as well, just because I think unless you've experienced it, it's really kind of hard to explain how much those campaigns permeate the campus. I graduated a number of years ago, so I don't think I'm the best person to answer how that particular policy has affected students on campus. I always think it's best to talk to the people there. That's what I learned when I was at Columbia, because what we were experiencing at Columbia was fundamentally different than what students were experiencing in California. Yes, it was the same BDS campaign. Yes, it was the same apartheid wall, but the rhetoric and the way it kind of manifested itself is unfortunately unique on each campus. So I think for that question, I would definitely want to talk to some of the students. I think it's a really interesting question. But definitely it's those sorts of campaigns, they single out a particular group of people on campus. Of course, they're the Jewish students. And, you know, I was told as a student, why don't I just ignore it? You know, why do I have to care so much about what's going on? And even if I had wanted to ignore it, I mean, that would mean that I had to close my eyes when I walked on campus past an anti-Israel protest. It would mean I would have to walk like this up the stairwell because there was banners everywhere. It would mean I would have to turn the other direction when I saw a professor at a BDS event. It permeates campus, so it's something needs to be done. I think it'd be really interesting to ask some current students if they've noticed a change so far.
Great, thank you for that. Next question is from an audience member who says she knows it's a very delicate question. However, Democrat Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, I'm sorry, can you hear me? Beth, can you guys hear me? Sorry, I think there was a delay. Okay, Democrat Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, and Ocasio-Cortez have made numerous anti-Semitic comments, and the media repeats these statements over and over. How do you think this impacts the way that Jews vote?
So I think on that subject, I just want to mention that NGO Monitor, again, we monitor the NGOs, but what we often see happening is those particular congresswomen, they often are using the rhetoric of different NGOs. I'm sure many of you know that there was supposed to be a trip to Israel, and those individuals were supposed to meet with different Palestinian organizations. And NGO Monitor exposed the anti-Semitic group that was organizing that trip. So that's kind of where our unique role comes in showing that it's not just spontaneously from them. There's this whole network. There's these NGOs. They're feeding the information into these different politicians. So I think it's hard to say in terms of how people are going to vote. But from our perspective, what really worries us is that these NGOs promote these campaigns and elected politicians will pick them up without fact checking. So we work very hard. And I should say also, we're a research institute. So we work with a number of other organizations to promote our research and make sure that they know that the elected officials know that if they're quoting a group like Defense for Children International Palestine, what that group is actually all about, that it's actually a BDS group. So that's where our role comes in that conversation.
Thank you. Next question. Have there been any international funds to Palestinian terrorist groups to combat COVID-19 in Palestinian territories?
Okay. I particularly like that question because it's tied into a subject we've been working on now. There's been I'll say this, there's been a significant influx in funding for humanitarian aid because of COVID-19, which, okay, it makes sense. You know, different countries around the world, they're in need of supplies, they're in need of masks and gloves and ventilators, and the countries around the world that have the capabilities want to help out. So we've seen nearly $40 million in humanitarian aid, new humanitarian aid, flowing in into the region to combat COVID-19. Now, has any of it gone directly to Hamas? I don't think so. I would hope not. But what we know is that there's a number of non-governmental organizations where a number of the officials, where a number of the board members have ties to terror groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And that is very worrisome, because when a number of board members, when NGO officials, when the accountant of these NGOs is suddenly convicted or indicted on crimes of being part of a violent terror attack, that's very worrying. Some of these organizations are even officially labeled as, you know, the PFLP's health workers affiliated, or the PFLP's agricultural group. And we do know that some of those organizations are going to be recipients of some of the COVID-19 funds. So it's very worrying, to say the least.
Thank you. Next question. The schools shut down soon after the changes President Trump made last December. How do you think the changes will affect the situation on campus? Can you foresee any tactics the schools might use to get around the changed protections against anti-Israel rhetoric and campaigns?
So that's similar to the previous question, which, like I said, I think it'd be really interesting to ask the students on campus. I think they would be the best equipped to answer that question. In terms of if the tactics will evolve, I'm sure. I mean, one tactic that is always used and that the BDS campaigners will use is that any attempt to critique the campaign is a silencing of free speech, which of course isn't true. If there's a dialogue, if there's opinions, I can tell you from my experience on campus, we often wanted to debate and engage with the different voices on campus. And the BDS groups often have a policy of anti-normalization, where they won't engage in any dialogue with the other side. So I would bet those sort of campaigns that we've seen them use before will come back.
All right, guys, if you want to put in any more questions, okay, we just got another question. If billions of dollars of donations magically came into NGO Monitor, what would be the priorities in putting this new money to work?
So we are often, there's so much money not to us, there's so much money going to different non-governmental organizations. It is so hard to keep up with it. That my colleagues are some of the smartest people out there, but I can tell you right now, we each monitor multiple countries, tracking the funding, tracking the NGO campaigns. If we had more funds, and if I was, you know, queen for a day, I would hire some more, you know, smart people like my colleagues, so that we could monitor, better monitor all of the different organizations, so that we could ensure that we're tracking as we are now, but even to a higher degree, that we would be able to track that funding. And I think you would see, we would be able to publish even more reports. We would be able to have even more outreach, network with even more organizations, like the Women's Committee. And I think that's what I would do. I see we do so much research, but there's so much more that we could do, and we just need more hands in order to do it.
Okay, how do world leaders respond to the blood libel that Israel spreads the virus to Palestinians by the NGO groups?
So it's a campaign right now. What we're doing is we're bringing this issue up. What we do at NGO Monitor is first, you know, we find the research, we put it together, and then we do our outreach. So we're right now in the outreach stage of publishing the research, I have an article on the subject coming out hopefully today that will talk about these sorts of campaigns, and that's how we get the attention. That's how we make sure the leaders know and can affect policy change. In this case, what we're most worried about, as I said, is the huge amount of new funding that's going to go to these NGOs because it's labeled as COVID-19. So that's something that we're very worried about, that we're closely watching, and we're encouraging the government to respond to.
Great. I think we have time for just one more question if anyone wants to put one in. All right, I think we'll end it here. Becca, thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. We were so fortunate to have you with us. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we end?
No, just thank you so much for having me. I encourage all of you, if this was interesting, again, visit our website. We're also on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Please follow us. We publish these sorts of campaigns. You know, I wish we didn't have to publish these sorts of information all the time, but we do. And also, if there's an organization you've come across that isn't on our website that you think we should know about, please send it our way so we can look into it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you guys for attending.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.